In a world of self-promotion, in a world of self-esteem, self-worth that speaks of dignity and honoring the true self, is there still a place for Christian humility? What can we learn from the monks of old, and how can it connect to our everyday lives? That's what we're talking about today. Welcome back to the Attaching to God podcast. I'm Geoff Holsclaw, and we are exploring a neuroscience-informed discipleship and spiritual formation. As always, this is produced by the Center for Embodied Faith. Today, we are continuing our monastic series, if we want to call it that, where we are looking at the roots of Christian monasticism and asceticism as a resource for discipleship, spiritual formation, and even just everyday living. And today we have our regular guest, David Clayton. He is our field reporter of a kind of monastic spirituality. We call him the voice from the Kelly, which, see, I didn't have the right kind of, British accent there, but the voice of the Kelly, which is the monastic cells from the deserts. David is a spiritual director and a supervisor of spiritual directors. He is a trained behavioral analyst and a facilitator of psychological safety. So glad to have you back.
Great to be here, Geoff. As ever, a absolute joy to be talking about this stuff and sharing conversation with yourself.
Well, before we jump into the topic of humility and some of the subtopics there, you were on a trip. So it's not just that you're glad to be here, like you're glad to be back to where you are. So tell us just really quickly, you were doing a bunch of interesting things.
Yeah, well, quick. It was a quick retreat, research trip, looking at a few areas of historic spirituality and trying to rest in the midst of that and pray. We found some interesting stuff, which I won't go into today, but one point was we managed to spend some time looking at a 4th century catacomb church relating to St. Agatha, a martyr killed on Sicily, and then was related to Malta, and became the patron saint of part of Malta. But the key thing was I met one of the order of Agatha, who are specific to the catacombs and specific to the 4th century church and altar. And it was just something experiential. I mean, just being in the place brought one to a degree of humility to think that this altar had been serving the bread and wine of the host since the 4th century. I mean, obviously not on a regular basis. There is a church above it, but it was just quite powerful and quite thought-provoking. So, yeah, I've come back a bit tanned. I managed to dip into some Carmelite stuff as well while I was away, which was an absolute joy, and some other bits and bobs, which we'll probably pick up on another time.
Absolutely. So just because we're always trying to educate people in the language, the Carmelite, that's a tradition that's often, if you know the names of like St. Teresa of Avila or St. John of the Cross, they're in the Carmelite world. We won't dive more into that. But this church was an old church, and underneath the old church is a very old catacomb that has been celebrating faith in Christ, love of God for almost 1,500 years. That's amazing. That's so amazing.
Yeah.
Just to kind of think about. Well, with that long kind of perspective in mind, the ancient kind of perspective still calling out and shaping us, there is some of an older term, not an older term, that's not quite the idea, but it seems antiquated these days, of humility. I think in our modern culture, where we're emphasizing love, value, or worthiness rather, having an inner posture of dignity, the Christian idea of humility, which sometimes gets connected to being worthless, or a worm, even as you read some of these, remember that you're a worm.
Nice bit of Calvin there.
Yeah. Well, right. So, and I also, just to add it, and if you have thoughts to add, feel free, but there's also a lot of like what we could, for lack of a better term, called ex-evangelicals who strongly react against like the Christian doctrine of sin as being detrimental to a sense of self-worth and even harmful to our mental health. And that speaking of humility is damaging, is often kind of how I see them talk about it. That's almost setting you up to be abused, if not being abusive. So I don't know if you have any other kind of what makes us resist to humility that you'd want to add, and if not, that's fine.
I think part of what you've mentioned there is the key current theme of the social standing and representation of self through identity rather than through capability or action or behavior. So therefore, if somebody has a hurt situation, which is, there are lots of people out there who've been hurt by the church in various denominations, but that develops a victimhood. So therefore their identity becomes victim, and therefore they present others as wrong and humility as a negative sense. Whereas humility would be, from the desert tradition, dealing with the sin, dealing with the chaos, and putting oneself not under, but below the other person, and not judging them, and going, no, I've sinned more than you, so therefore I can't judge you, and taking that, and my sins follow me, so therefore I can't judge you, I can't represent any critical. That, no, obviously that doesn't take away from critical thinking, that emphasizes critical thinking and reasoning and or grounded behavior. So that'll be a quick response to that. And again, that's off the cuff. That's off the cuff.
Yeah.
So,
Well, you started introducing some of the concepts that we're going to be getting to. What I heard right there in my words is sometimes I think our Protestant, especially, so I'll speak, a Protestant American kind of view of humility is something like humility is a way of reminding myself that God is God and I'm not, that everything is grace, that I'm undeserving. And so in that sense, I am worthless, that I'm in a state of being worthless, but God's grace overcomes even that, and moves forward, and then salvation and things like that. And so, but that's not exactly how the monastic tradition, I think, understands it. And what I heard you say is that humility is almost like a process or a posture that we're inhabiting. It's not like our state of being before God, although it is, but it's a little different. So my summary, and then I'd love to kind of hear how it goes, is that humility is really just creating space for love of God and others in us that pride or other things pushes out, and that humility helps cultivate purity of heart so that we can enter into God's kingdom. But it's not really, and it sounds very like self-deprecating, but that's actually not its goal. It's part of this process. If that was a quick once over, what are your thoughts there?
It's about being small.
It's about being small. Yeah. Humility is about being small.
I think, just from your description there, that would be the consolidation of how I heard that, and would fit in with the Carmelite aspect of Therese of Lisieux, the little flower, all her theology and humility, and she's an example of apostolic living. When she couldn't leave her room, she was ill. So it's about being small and understanding how big God is, I suppose. And not just big God, but that love, that faith, trust, that assurance that even when things are going wrong, things are painful, she died of like a tuberculosis type ailment, it was incredibly painful. And yet she smiled all the way through it. She had very human moments. But I just use that as a kind of frame of between us in contemporary society and the far history of the desert, because there's the link with Carmelite spirituality. It's based around the desert fathers, the desert spirituality. And but I think one way of looking at it is humility is truth in motion. It is not a self-deprecating aspect, but clear seeing. in a way, if you to frame it through something like psychological safety, it gives the capability to remain open to reality without defense. I think it kind of ties into what we're talking about. So it's a deactivation of defensive bias, to use technical language. So it's taking away the self-security rooted and to be, admit weakness without fragmentation, to be small.
To be small in the sense of vulnerability is not necessarily weakness.
Yeah.
Well, there's so much there. We're gonna peel
go.
those layers. Truth in motion, clear seeing, openness to reality without defense. I love all that. So, and that's what humility is supposed to cultivate in us. But I bet everyone who's listening right now would never have thought of it that way. But before we get into that, let's talk about the Bible. Can we talk about the Word? As good, good evangelical that I am. We want to talk about the Word, but I have to talk about the Word by talking about the monastic tradition, because in the Rule of Saint Benedict, which is super old, roughly what year? I would want to say 400s, but I don't want to be wrong. It's super old. It kind of was one of the founding documents of monastic culture that we're pulling from. And so he has a whole chapter early on all about humility, which I think the middle parts many of us might kind of squirm at because he talks rather harshly. But at the beginning and at the end, it's really couched with God's love. And he references Psalm 131. So I just wanted to take a moment just to kind of look at Psalm 131.
Yeah.
And so he says, my heart is not proud, Lord. My eyes are not haughty. And that means lifted up, right? So that we're already getting to that humility right at the beginning. He says, I do not concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me. And my understanding is that's part of the concern of monks, to not speculate, not ramble on, not even talk a lot, right? In verse 2, it says, I have calmed myself. I have quieted myself. I am like a weaned child with its mother, like a weaned child, I am content. Verse 3, Israel, put your hope in the Lord both now and forever. And I think I was so glad that he brought this up, because I know St. Benedict and the monastic tradition, they're looking at those first two lines primarily as I'm not proud and I'm not lifting my eyes up. But verse 2 is really an attachment verse, which is this image of a child becoming small, becoming childlike, a child sitting with its mother. And a weaned child is one that is no longer feeding from its mother. Like a child, an infant who is still nursing, becomes very agitated near their mother, because that's where you get your food from. But a weaned child is no longer doing that. And so there's this strong attachment relationship that's not propelled by anxiety, but rather it has peace, it has calm. And that is, I think, one of the goals of humility, is to be able to become that contented child in God's presence. So I just wanted to start off with that one, that becoming small. There's lots of other scriptures that you're going to bring up here as we go, but this connection between becoming childlike, not having proud hearts. So, well, let's move. I'm gonna hand it over to you. You have a couple things: humility, metanoia, apatheia, all these fun words. But let's start with that truth in motion and the seeing clearly. And I just loved how you started talking about that.
Yeah. So I'd add to that, going back further, because obviously Benedict was kind of later. You would have Benedict and then you would have Carmelite. But going further back, Regis Ponticus talks about humility as forgetting injuries. And that kind of ties together much of what we talked about, that it's a kind of self-emptying cognition, choice, a reasoned choice, that releases the mind from resentment. And obviously, if we're talking in attachment language, then that's a crucial act of integration, letting go to process, to integrate. So if we were to look at let's go apathagma patrum. Let's go into the sayings of the Desert Father and start the ball rolling. So I think we talked on humility last time, and that's how we ended up at this point today. But starting with a new comment. So Abba Poman again regularly pops up. Humility is a garment of the Godhead, and therefore conversely within our body. But I like this bit. I like the idea of that this is like a garment, that this is something which is high. If we were to use that if we were using actualized language towards that encompassing in the divine, that would be moving towards a more integrated self. So therefore humility is a key part of that. In the Philokalia, and John Climacus's ladder, there's a reference that I think is key to this, that humility is the only thing that demons cannot imitate. Because pride makes demons out of angels. But humility could not make angels out of demons. So even if a demon was to act with humility, it couldn't, because it cannot. It's against its nature. It's the only thing. So therefore, there are many references within the apathagma patrum sayings, and within the Philokalia's teachings that present towards, if you can move your life towards anything, move it towards humility. Become small, not self-deprecating, because that, if I were to be use a broad brush comment on self-deprecation and negative view of self, that's just inverted pride. That's all, look at me, I'm so poor, weak, vulnerable, victimized. And those strong terms, but then there's an identity of I, and look at me, look at this. It's an emphasis. Whereas what this is talking about is looking at the other and going, you're better than me. How can I help you? How can I share charity? How can I get things out of the way? How can I change my mind? Metanoia. How can I get things out of the way? Apatheia. And how can I act towards a person in care and love and charity? So in a way, if we're looking at this from a science point of view, that this humility function is like self-presence in the IFS system. I'm not an IFS expert, but I've integrated some of the points of this. So it's the self's curiosity and calm aspect that allows the protected part, the manager's part, etc., to act on. And practically, I suppose that looks like humility is a door to open up a system to internal dialogue rather than coercive or impactful coercion within the self. So in a way, there's this like an oil within the self, within a person. I mean, if you meet somebody who's actually humble, they may not be like Uriah Heep in Dickens, I'm ever so humble. They may be quite brash and aggressive and but they may be really genuine, really caring, really integrated, and able to develop strong social connections. So
a couple of things came to mind there. And
sure.
One is probably a huge, and I was like, oh, I haven't thought of this recently. But what I heard you saying is that humility is really like an interpersonal dynamic that we're trying to establish. It's not self-referential, what is my worth and well-being in myself, by myself. That it's really an opening a space to let others in. And that goes back to, I think, the becoming smaller. I was thinking of like mimetic desire, the competitive desire, comparing ourselves with others. Can I get what they have? I'm jealous that I don't have the success that they have. I'm bitter that life didn't fall the same way that it did for so-and-so. And so there's that desire. So is the humility that the monks were after, and part of this was actually leaving the cities so they could be by themselves, was to disconnect that kind of mirroring desire that usually spirals downward rather than a vicious spiral, rather than a virtuous spiral, one that leads us above? Or am I taking this the wrong direction?
No, you crack on. I think I would add in, it's not just interpersonal to look at the behavioral science of it. There's an intrapersonal recognition and putting the work in, as in the behavioral science language, and dealing with the toxic stuff and doing the processing and dealing with the somatic trauma processing, and that all comes from that. So in a way, we could use the term socially transcendent for that. And I'm aware of a white paper that uses that, but to reference your point about stepping aside, I mean, that was to die. So this aspect of humility is to become less, to die, small deaths. And with that, there's a social transcendent aspect to that, which is the stepping away. That doesn't necessitate that everybody is called to go and live in a cave or to become, it's one of those things that's specific, I think. But with that, what that internal work enables is, so from a behavioral science point of view, humility acting with these behaviors reduces, or it affects the self-enhancing biases, the anchoring and confirmations, like you mentioned. It enables a person not to be driven by memetics, René Girard's principle of competing and becoming together to be safe. So in a way, what we could, if we're going to really dig into the behavioral stuff and the brain stuff, then what it is doing is the antithesis to the limbic brain survival process. Enables the person to step beyond the brain wanting to survive, but actually laying one's life down for others.
So in the language we use in our book and on this podcast a lot, then that's shifting from connection mode from protection mode, the survival instincts, to the connection and being open to not just relationship with others, but also able to explore different relationships with myself that maybe I've been closed off with in the midst of protecting myself from myself, but also from others. And so humility, as you're trying to describe it, is actually, as the psychological sciences that you're referencing, is actually this, it's a way not to be an animal. It helps us to be human as God made us.
Yeah.
So can we transition to the metanoia then? Because you were kind of,
I just wanted to
as
add
far
in
as I could okay,
I
go
just
ahead.
wanted to add in, so to define that, it creates a cognitive posture to receptive to new information.
Oh, yes, I like that. Okay, can you fill that out a little bit? How does humility create a posture to openness to new information? I love that.
We've just described that. It is by that process. What we're doing is allowing the self to become, this is a little bit of a loosey-goosey term, for a bit more flexible. We're doing the work so that, that doesn't mean we're going to be really nice, really. I don't like the word nice. I come from psychological safety background, so nice is an anathema to me in some degrees.
Right.
Nice is not necessarily, it's persona presented. It's everybody. If everybody smiles and puts on and doesn't even move their dishon muscle, then all is well with the world. No. Truth. This is about, humility is truth in motion. So this is facing the truth of self, facing the truth of person. And I remember hearing a talk a while back, and someone going, if you're at that level of understanding, then you've moved beyond naivety. You've moved into the recognition that things are bad, so therefore you become cynical. But then there's a movement beyond that cynicism where you take courage. So, as we move into the next point, then courage is this. Courage to be humble, courage to be small, courage to be vulnerable, and not in a negative way, because we're not talking about being nice and yourself to be victimized or downtrodden. This is, the monastics were severely countercultural and in a way quite aggressive towards development.
Mm-hmm.
They went out there on their own, did the inner work, but then there's a thing within some theological premise that look at the mystical cycle, where one will ascend into God and then return back to aid with what one has learned. Like some of the Celtic saints being stuck out on islands, being quite happy there, and then going the church going, "We want you to be a bishop," and they're like, "I don't want to be a bishop. I'm quite happy sat on my island with God. Thank you very much." So yeah, okay, metanoia. So there's a big word, Geoff. Do you want to explain that one, or do you want me to plonk some stuff on it?
Metanoia shows up in the gospel when Jesus announces, repent, for the kingdom of God is near. That repent is really the change of mind. It's to turn around. Didn't the prodigal son, as the story goes, didn't he change his mind? And so that's the repent. We often think means confess all the bad things about yourself, but which is part of repent in the Bible, of course. But the actual word means to turn around, right?
Old
Did I
Testament.
get that?
Old Testament turn.
Uh-huh.
New in the language. If you're going to be a little theological and etymological, indeed. New Testament metanoia, to change mind. So we have a reality here that is ontological. It's a state of being. It's a state of comprehension. And yes, diving into it, straight into where should we go? Should we go into the apathagma just for a little? So
no. Is there more to say about the changing of the mind?
well, I don't. I think we'll come on to that with the after. What I'd like to do is plonk some Desert Fathers in, and then pull out some neuroscience from it and emphasize that point, if I may.
All right. Well, okay. Before you do that, the one thing that came to mind was
Sure.
the noia, right? The mind. And you were talking about a new way, a state of being.
Ontological change, yeah.
And with that comes a new way of seeing. So when reality changes, then things that weren't apparent then become apparent. Things that seem to be important become less important. And so that change of being is a change of seeing in which we see ourselves and others. And so the reason why the change of seeing, I think, is important is because on the one hand, like outside, we'll just say outside of the Christian tradition or just salvation, if you view these words or the sayings of the Desert Father, or just kind of stumble upon Christian sermons about humility, they can sound revolting. They can sound like, what are they talking about? And why do they hate themselves so much? But that's outside of this new way of being and seeing, in which God, who loves us and who died for us, who came, for God to love the world, right? Outside of this whole kind of true, but I'll also say story, right? The story of God's love among us. Outside of that, if you're not seeing within that, then these things do seem foreign, offensive, and confusing. So I just wanted to emphasize that.
I'll jump in on that as well and go that the current sort of climate of emotional intelligence and developing a viewpoint from what we call emotional intelligence presents exactly that. But if people understand humility, come from that, and therefore the understanding of what we're talking about, the gospel does not become clear without an insight into it. I don't think. I mean, Scripture talks about that, but I think from a behavioural point of view, there is a synergy between the becoming of the Christian journey, the metanoia, the turning away, the humility, the development, because that is an actualized process. And that would be the point to emphasize. So there is a parallel between actualizing in an emotionally intelligent way and actualizing in a Christian way. So somebody may recognize a taste of, oh, that person is actually humble. And again, their package may be not presenting, oh, I'm ever so humble, I'm nice and all of that, but there's something about them. So I just want to pull out that little thought that when people change, they change. That's an intrapersonal work that develops towards an emotional intelligence and therefore a behavioral thing. So the COM model, capability, motivation, and opportunity towards behavior in that behavioral cycle can make a difference. It's attention and awareness towards opportunity and can affect relational context. So when God wishes to have mercy on a soul, he allows something to happen so that it may humble and repent. That's Isaac Theban from the Apophthegmas, from the Saints. So in a way, there is a psychological thing here, and I love doing this. So Freud, Adler, and Jung all talk about personality is developed by love. So therefore, they put in the premise that perfect love creates perfect personality. So therefore, the necessity for divinity to infuse the process of a person's actualization is the only way that they will ever become their actual or true self, or the higher towards that. And we could get into how psychotherapy views absolute viewpoint and absolute self. That's another thing. But there is something there of maybe we need the divine to become.
Yeah.
And I think from
not maybe we do.
Just maybe.
Not maybe.
Yeah,
Not
we
maybe.
do. We do.
Maybe from that before the repentance, the change of mind outside of the Christian story, then the maybe is a maybe, because it's just, you're just trying to figure out how to explain the phenomena of human existence. But within our story, we know that is the image of God within us that's only fulfilled. So excellent. All right.
Imago Dei. You got the Imago Dei in.
That's right.
Crikey. There's so much in this. These poor people, their heads must be going, all this stuff.
We'll see. We'll see if I get feedback.
Okay.
Well, so were we shifting on to apathy?
Well,
then?
no, I'm still in metanoia. I know we're in. I know we said we'd get through as much as we can get through. So, but I just think there is the from the Philokalia, the principle of watchfulness. Hesychios talks of this diligence, vigilance in attention to thought. I mean, we talked of some of this last time with the logismoi, those funny furry aliens that come down from those 8 thoughts of sinful behavior, So I think there is something of this. The way to engage in change is to become more intrapersonal, not navel gazing, but have the ability to recognize one's behavior. I spoke to an amazing behavioral, what would you call them? I'm trying to, anyway, an expert in behavioral science who operates in business and in other sectors. And they came out with a saying that I thought was, to use the term humble and really, really opened up the conversation. They noticed that at times they had looked at themselves and gone, why the hell did I do that? And then they went, I did that because I haven't dealt with A, B, and C in my past. And they recognized the pattern of their behavior, cared for themselves, got some help, dealt with their attachment, all of that complexity. And whether that was through a psychotherapeutic process or not, I don't know. I mean, we're talking intrapersonal work, so therefore a person's journey is a person's journey. So within this, there's this attentiveness, which comes back to the prayer, which comes back to the contemplation, which comes back to the meditation, which comes back to the neuroscience, strengthening cortical thickness, through regular contemplation or mindfulness, which business is all over at the moment. Neuroscience is all over at the moment, trying to develop that through the use of psychedelics and other bits and bobs. I have conversations with people about that. But there is this kind of how do we develop the regions linked to our attention, our emotional regulation, because this is all behavior, emotion intelligence, regulation. And again, a person who is nice does not mean that they are emotionally regulated. They may have chaos going off inside of them. Well, most of us have chaos going off inside of us. But it's how we deal with it. I mean, I think one of my favorite things about the Desert Fathers is their viewpoint of going into the desert was simply to deal with sin. Now, if we change that language, they went into the desert to deal with the chaos, the disordered, and to bring about good self-attached, good mental and emotional health, good behaviors. I mean, most of them were really grumpy. Some of them had some terrible backgrounds, serious criminals, prostitutes, all sorts. I'm not saying they're bad, but they're not holy. They wouldn't be seen as holy people, but they were extremely holy. So they learned to deal with the chaos and bring about, we could say, like an Eden-like movement towards Eden-like. So the metanoia is a self-led negotiation that helps the kind of exiled parts integrate, to face the shame, to face the fear, to face the self-deprecating even. Because I mean, if we're looking at humility is not self-deprecating based on shame and fear, because it wouldn't be humility. So there's something more, something whole, something holy about this. So, and I think in some clinical studies, and this is towards the IFS thing, so it's more your area, but I think there's been reports that symptoms have been benefited through narrative and through engaging with this slowing kind of process, this internalizing and facing, so that you are non-judgmentally engaging with the different parts of the self. I'm not going to quote references, but
okay. So I'm just taking a note here.
Yeah. Did I know something you didn't on IFS?
No. This is all great. Like
I
want to keep it practical, and the IFS and non-judgmental. One is you mentioned two things.
Sure.
Like being non-judgmental, and I was thinking too, like the modern kind of correlate in kind of the therapy speak or business speak is often something like, "Hey, we want to make space for people," right? Or that's like the stated goal. And what I'm hearing and what I'm thinking through is the virtue, if we could call it that, or the practice of humility, is how you make space. But oftentimes we're just like, you do better at making space in people. Well, like I haven't done the work to make space in myself, right? So this is where humility comes in, and then the non-judgmental. I was thinking, you were talking about this, whoever this person was who had in some meeting or a situation blurted out they weren't their best selves. They behaved in a way that they thought was inappropriate or was just less than themselves, right? So then they go off and do work to figure that out. But a lot of times, so that takes humility, right? That takes humility to say, because our defensive mechanism. So if I did something like that early on in my life, I'm thinking back my teenage years and my 20s, the way I would respond to me behaving badly would be defensively protecting, which would be something like, well, so-and-so made me do it, right? It's a very, usually it's very, it's a very complicated way, but that's the essence of my defense of myself is either it's someone else's fault,
not my fault,
or it would be something like, well, that happened, but that's not who I am, right? So then you're saying no to that part. That's not really who I am. But the humble person, or the one who's open to reality, the one who is non-judgmentally surveying all the information would be curious to say, hey, that part of me, what if that is me? What if that's a bigger part of me than I admit to myself? Like that's a moment of metanoia, of confession, but it's also a moment of humility to say that thing that I don't like about me might be the true me right now, or the me that's more regularly showing up than I allow, right? So humility allows you to do that self work, and it also opens up space for other people to do the other work. Because these things like being non-judgmental, it's like they're kind of slogans now, but how do you actually do that? Well, you do it by cultivating humility, isn't that right?
Yeah. I think the desert. Yep. That's it. I mean, the desert. The desert fathers are kind of treat these things simply, and it's like put others above you. I love
Yeah.
one of the best ways that.
Well, hold on. I wanna jump in. I'm
Go.
brainstorming. You can help me out because I think the way it goes, I should probably have a debriefing session with Sid about this podcast, about what I'm about to say. But I think the way it goes is we want to value being non-judgmental. Okay, great. We can all agree on that. How do we cultivate non-judgmentality? It's to affirm our self-worth. It's to remember that I'm good enough, smart enough, and doggone it, people like me, according to the old Saturday Night Live skit. But how can you be sure that that's true? Without, as you said before, Freud and Jung and others, without a transcendent reference who guarantees, because we're made in God's image, without that reference that we actually are inherently worthy, we don't actually know that that's true. And so you actually need the Christian story of the God who made us and loves us, who came down to prove and demonstrate that love to us on the cross, to help us know that we are worthy. And we can only get into that story effectively through humility. So non-judgmentalness can't be achieved by just affirming outside of the Christian narrative that we're worthy. We actually have to affirm that we're worthy because we're in the image of God, and God himself practiced humility by not considering equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, made himself small in order to become human and even to die on a cross. This is Ephesians chapter 2. And so that's what I'm thinking and saying. I don't know, David, if you're jiving with that, but that's where my brain's going right now.
I like it, and I can see your.
You can disagree with me.
No,
I can handle it.
I'm not going to disagree with you. I'm going to agree with your point. Your point is from your dialectic, which is evangelical, theological, and broader theological. So therefore, there is a deistic model which is based around Christian rather than Judeo-Christian bit. So I'd be really annoying and go even within the broader tradition of world religion. If you were to understand the philosophy that is towards, you would find that there is a more softer right brain, if I remember rightly, McGill-Cresswell. So if you were to communicate with, say, someone from, and I'm trying to think on the work I read on philosophy. India is a good example. So would be Japan or something like that. There's a much softer, they're not necessarily Christian, but there is a much softer, much more humble, more humanely attached kind of presentation, not necessarily whole, and they're all different, and there is good and bad and negatives in all of this complex stuff. So what we could say is, from a spiritual model or a deistic model, the influence of the spiritual, I'm not going to say religious, I'm going to say spiritual, and that's not spiritual, not religious. We're not talking that. We're talking actual formative behaviors within a social pattern which come from a philosophical or theological basis. Then there is something of this ability to treat another in a different way, in a more, we'll use that term, humility. You could use the terms in a more emotionally intelligent way, to be frank. So I think you're absolutely right in what you're saying from a Christian point of view, and particularly with your evangelical thing. But I would broaden that framework and go, look at the world of human beings, and there's something else here which the Desert Fathers represent clearly. And that's why we're talking about them, because they represent something which is holding a value in this day and age,
Right.
a freedom, that freedom to let go, that apatheia, if you were, to...
Well, let's go into that. The apatheia.
Okay.
So that's the technical word. Some people feel like it's being emotionless. So is to say no, and pathia is like a passion. This is the old kind of way of speaking. So passionless, and sometimes that gets understood in the current day as emotionless, which is not quite accurate. But anyways, that's what the word kind of means. But the concept of the word and how it's used and what it's supposed to do is something different. So why don't you kind of, it's not, I'll just say apatheia, as David's about to explain, it doesn't mean to be apathetic as in uncaring, disinterested, aloof, or kind of disconnected. So over to you.
Okay. Nice classification of the difference between Stoicism and Christian apatheia. Yeah.
There we go.
Nicely done. And I think that's, because St. Ignatius of Loyola would present the principle of indifference. And again, that's a word which presents the same kind of attitude to have the removal of disordered affections. And again, this is part of the metanoia, part of the change. So it's becoming, and I love when I'm doing presentations on this kind of stuff to express it as Michelangelo's David and the stripping away of bits of marble to reveal the truth. As humans, that's painful. And that's why we don't like doing it. And we don't like change. And we go, oh no, that's me. Or we go, that's not part of me. I'm going to suppress it and hide it and deal with it. But when you're in the desert, you've only got yourself to face. And that's the point of this prayer aspect of slowing down. So, Poman again, Abba Poman.
Great.
Says to be still, a stranger to the passions, and keep your mind continually on God. So there's something of an intentional focus, which he emphasizes, and leaning into. I've been careful not to lean into too much of Rajis and Cassian, because I can just do it all on a Rajis and Cassian. It gets a little bit, they describe between them that apatheia is a state where passions no longer rule the heart, and the mind rests in God. So this is not, like you described, an absence from feeling, but a freedom from compulsive activity, the drivenness that I must. So underneath, so if you look at it from a psychological point of view, it's a way of addressing the drives and causes within our deeper psychological makeup. So we could say that, to look at apatheia means that one is willing to go into that process where one heals the early development issues. So we're talking, this is really looking at emotional intelligence. So from that, if we're looking at Porgy's polyvagal theory, just to throw another pin on it, because a lot of people like polyvagal stuff, and I think it is brilliant. The body holds its score. I read a book the other day, The Soul Holds Its Score, which was fascinating. But another.
Well, Stephen Porges did
Go on.
polyvagal. Bessel van der Kolk did Body Keeps the Score, which is polyvagal adjacent, but they're not exactly the same thing. But
no, but he Bessel references. I think a lot of the somatic stuff that's going around in a minute. So for me, okay, rather than
just for listeners who are worried we're going to get lost in this, we're probably going to do a whole nother episode just on apatheia, because I was like, David and I were talking about this one. He's like, we're going to talk about humility, but we're also going to talk about metanoia, and we're also going to talk about apathy. I was like, we can do all that in one episode. So we're probably going to deep dive. So why don't we just move on from the polyvagal
Yep,
and just
okay.
kind of put a pin.
But I just
We'll
wanted
put
to
a pin
say
in it for another
brain,
time.
3
Yeah.
brains here,
Yeah.
1 brain here, and 1 brain here. So that would be what we're dealing with. That's why I wanted to bring that in. Because if we feel safe in those, in our intrapersonal, we'll be able to feel safe in our extrapersonal. So there is something of the somatic. That's why I wanted to bring that in relation to the apathy, the stripping away, the becoming from lying traumas, if you would. So which comes into, go on.
Okay.
I was going to go into contemplation then.
I was going to go into the polyvagal stuff even after I said not to. So I'm going to move. Okay. We're going to not do it.
We'll pause.
Go ahead.
And dear listeners, we will return to this topic at some point.
That's right.
There's just so much. So for this, we're looking at a neuroplasticity of emotions. And the key here is the making the mind rest in God, letting no longer the passions rule the heart, being still in the contemplatio. If we were to look at from the Benedictine model, the movement from lectio, oratio, meditatio, contemplatio, to move through that into a slowing of self, so that in short, the nervous system feels safe enough to regulate stillness. So this is a practical thing, and we're looking at, I've ran contemplative groups for donkey's years. One of them's been going for like 5 years online. And it's all about practicing towards contemplation, the point of making it achievable, because it is an actual mystic ascent. So this is not an easy movement. This is a movement into full emotional intelligence, into being actualized towards recognizing, loving and caring for others, because one becomes free, one becomes humble, small, puts others themselves, which is countercultural to our current social dynamic, because the machine drives towards how Geoff described it earlier. So it's an integrative part, not a suppression, which I think is key to a lot of your attachment work, if I'm right, Geoff. It's not about
integration's goal.
Yeah. So it's not about suppressing. So in a way, this pathia, I would throw down the practice of developing prayer, and that's a big word, and across cultures it means many different things, but if you look at the historic basis of prayer and the movement of the desert, it's towards stillness, towards silence, towards becoming nothing with no thing, to use the full mystical ascent. So yes,
becoming like a weaned child who has quieted themselves and is
Perfect.
Content.
That's it.
Is that right?
That's
Which
it.
is the goal. So I think, and again, we'll spend quite a bit of time another time on apatheia, but it sounds like apathy, because metanoia and apatheia, repentance, and kind of this
We can do full sessions on them.
Yeah,
They're huge.
Is kind of the inner working, or the things you have to keep coming to so you can cultivate the humility, which then in turn itself cultivates an openness to love others. And so I think you said it's a way of kind of clearing out the disordered stuff. So it's not a clearing out of all emotion or all kind of loves and just becoming, numb. But rather it's just getting the things out of the way so you can be who God made you to be. And I think it also helps you to see clearly, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have these distortions, and cultivating apatheia is a way of seeing truly, which is what you said at the beginning, is that humility is truth in motion. And so we need to see truly.
And just to add to that, and I'm aware that we are nearly at an hour, it enables the final point, which is charity. And just to touch on that, and I don't think we've got time to go into it, but if we were to look at the Desert Father's attitude, this is the core reason for humility: to love, to care, to have, So I'm not sure it's Besser or Poman again, but it's if you see your brother in sin, throw over him the mantle of your love. Do not give your heart to that which does not satisfy. I think there's two sayings in one there. So a lot of this, if we were to look at Philokalia and Maximus, true love is unsurprised, non-possessive vision that sees all in God and acts for healing. So it's that caring for somebody. If somebody sins against you, we'll go. I think one of the key trends within the Desert Fathers is somebody sins against you. That's one sin against you. That's one offense. Well, how many times have you offended? So therefore, don't throw the stone, because you haven't got a right to throw the stone because you've sinned as well. So therefore that enables the person to go, that's okay. You made a mistake. I mean, if they keep making the mistake, then obviously they need education, and that's another social reality. But I think for this humility to move towards that aspect of being more social, not being so mimetic and competitive and divisive, because currently it's a difficult world out there. So I think the more we engender this kind of behavior within ourselves and develop true emotional intelligence and good behaviors, might be a bit better.
So just to kind of finish off then,
Yeah.
and we could brainstorm together, but what would be the way, how could someone inhabit this, say, in their work environment, at their local church, in a small group? Because it doesn't mean, what we're not saying is that you don't show up, you don't share your ideas, you don't take responsibility, you don't hold others to account according to, whatever your job position is. We're in the world doing these activities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so how does all these things that we're talking about, how then does it inhabit, like in a work environment? Like, how does that enhance or kind of work there?
I've just written a paper on that for somebody.
All right, what's the summary?
Yeah, no, I can't do that. So what I would say is self-knowledge, courageous in intrapersonal work, which can require accompaniment. So I'd obviously, being a spiritual director, encourage spiritual direction. And again, spiritual direction is a very different modality towards psychotherapy, etc., because there are 3 chairs in the room. So therefore the divine is involved. So therefore the depth can go deeper to the different aspects. So that level of accompaniment is helpful. And in a work environment, it pans into the world of psychological safety to take the masks off and have frank conversations. But obviously there are parameters and limits to that. I'm not into. There's something I'm writing at the moment. That's why I'm stuttering a little, because this is all kind of processing. So about how much we show up with our true self at work or in social gatherings. How, where is the persona engaging, and how emotionally honest can and should we be? There's a part of the comment is from Eva P, who's an ex-Secret Service agent, and she's like, don't judge the people by being people in their relationships, judge them by their behaviors. And she's a person who I disagree with some of her stuff. I'll be very clear on that, because she's like, you should not turn up with your true self to work. And I'm like, well, I think, I can't remember her name. One of the other influencers I was listening to recently was talking about, we turn up to work as we turn up to work. We are emotional beings, we're human beings, and therefore we will have a degree of our true self turning up to work. We don't turn up and necessarily splurge. So I think this all talks about regulation, self-love, self-care. What is it like for you to sit in a room on your own? Is that a difficult thing? Is that an easy thing? Because these are the things where we learn where our integration is at. You know what I mean? I've seen people go into silence and it crack their noodles. They can't. It really does cause them distress, and that doesn't mean, oh, I'm not an introvert, so therefore I can't do that. Introverts and extroverts can go into silence just as easily. It's about intentional focus. So what am I saying? That's a little bit of a ramble, and I do apologize. It's a little bit rambly because you've tied into some stuff I'm writing on. But does that help? Right. Does that clarify? I mean,
outside of like moving in with people in their work, I know some of the buzzwords in the industry these days is like radical acceptance. Is how can we just accept reality rather than judge it? There's the non-judgmental that we've been talking about. There's also another buzzword is radical candor, which is can we just say what needs to be said instead of dancing around it? And those all sound like great values, but without a humility, or in a sense, without ego investment, that self-protective ego, right? Mm-hmm. So that could be a way of talking about it is, can you engage in relationships and responsibilities, accountabilities without ego protection, ego investment, but rather the humility to allow the person in front of you to be a whole person, and then also to pursue the goals of your company without your kind of ego being involved. I think another one might be just cultivating curiosity of self and of others rather than condemnation. So often it's just bad performance of myself or someone else that you then get on, but then the curiosity to kind of ask deeper questions. And so that doesn't mean not having accountability, but it is being curious rather than condemning. So those are just a couple of things that were coming to mind that might be fruits of this kind of
psychological safety.
Humility. Yeah, psychological safety.
It's
exactly.
But with that, one thing I've come to mind is the that doesn't give an answer. I mean, I facilitate these conversations and see it when you find the moments and the points where within the group there is that dissonance. Mm-hmm. So there's a necessity of critical thinking. I mean, throughout, I think we'll come back to this time and time again, that there is, otherwise what are you grounding it on? You could have a mimetic going off there that's grounded in identity and perception, that's not actually grounded in solid thinking. So mm-hmm. The key point I would say to that in those conversations where you're taking masks off is to be grounded in critical thinking. Why is this happening? What is really happening? What's the underlying truth? And therefore it comes back to the humility, the truth in motion.
So we've been talking about so many things. This is so helpful. Talking about having a change of mind, seeing reality clearly, making space. And these can be buzzwords. They can kind of be values. But really, we're trying to understand all these things from this essential kind of piece of humility that we've been talking about, that David's helping us pull forward. So this monastic series is going to continue in a sense. We haven't decided, we haven't mapped it all up, but we'll probably spend some more time on metanoia and apatheia, certainly kind of understanding. And David, you mentioned kind of this wrestling with sin. And so how does this kind of desert monastic understanding of sin, how can that help us? We have kind of other lists. The list is not in front of us, but we have some topics. So thank you for taking some time. I know you have lots of projects that you've just been called into, which are taking a lot of your time. So thank you for taking a moment to be with us again. And we're going to do this again sooner than later, I hope.
Super. Thanks, Geoff. It's been a stimulating and challenging conversation as ever, and I hope our listeners are enjoying the development of this voice from Kellia, this process that we're kind of throwing out there. And I'm sure you are, Geoff, are really interested in hearing people's feedback and perspective and thoughts, and any areas that they think, oh, would you explain that? Would you talk about that? Because it's not about our conversation, it's about the bigger impact. So we want to hear from you. Okay.
Well, and my hope is that after a little while, we're just kind of getting all these terms, and they're Greek terms, they're foreign, but once we lay a foundation, hopefully people will start really getting a sense of like why this is important and how it's such a valuable resource. So we're just going to keep doing it.
Yeah.
Even if nobody keeps listening, you and I are going to have a great time, but I'm sure other people will be blessed. Well, thank you so much, David. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Geoff. And you. God bless. Bye-bye.